development-related issues. Although Michael is currently on leave this spring semester at NYU, there are two places in New York where you can study development, NYU and Columbia. The fact that he's at NYU rather than Columbia, I think, indicates something about Michael.
And not by that deep.
There could be a seminar on that.
Yeah, there could be a seminar on that. That's not the topic of his talk today. But Michael received a BS in engineering from Caltech, and then an MA in economics and environmental management from Johns Hopkins, and then finally a PhD in economics from Harvard. He's written extensively about a wide range of topics. A lot of his recent work has been on migration, which he's going to talk about today, but he's also done work on economic history, on the subject of growth and development, on international public finance. He's also engaged in a lot of the public policy debate over what foreign aid ought to be and what we can expect from it. So his topic today is skilled migration and skill creation, evidence from military coups in the Fiji Islands. Please, Michael.
Great, thanks a lot. So thanks so much for inviting me here, and for all of you for coming. Before I take you on a trip to Fiji, I want to talk about why I'm interested in this subject and how this very specific little paper fits into a broader research agenda. And I'm interested, as Frank mentioned recently and in the near term, in this relationship between migration and development. And as an economist, I'm interested in it because I think that barriers to international migration are, without a doubt, one of the largest single forces. Wow, this is very interesting. Yes, this is not the part of East Asia I wanted to go to. We're getting interest from all over the world. So why do I think that barriers to migration are one of the biggest distortions to the world economy, distortions to opportunities for people living in poor countries? For many, many reasons, one of which is that if I take the same good, the same tradable good, it's hard to find tradable goods in this day and age that sell in different markets for price differences of greater than 50%. It's harder to find financial instruments that sell in different markets for price differences exceeding 15%. It's very easy to find a laborer whose labor sells in different places for price differences of 1,000%. This is what I'm talking about. This huge disparity is something that economist Lant Pritchett calls the cliff at the border. And I'm interested in understanding, characterizing the cliff at the border in an academic sense, because I think it's very, very poorly understood why it exists. And in a policy sense, I'm interested in ways that policy could somehow take advantage of the cliff at the border for development. This makes me one of the few migration economists who is more interested in emigration than immigration. It's kind of a rare thing. And this entire research agenda faces a big challenge, a systematic challenge, which is that people leave places where things are bad, more or less. So across the world and at all fractal levels, you can see bad development outcomes of various kinds, political problems, economic problems, health problems associated with immigration all over the world and in rural to urban areas and in many different settings. So somebody who wants to understand the effects of immigration on development faces this challenge of separating causation from correlation, because the correlation is systematically negative across a broad variety of settings. And it's that reason that brings me to focus a lot on natural experiments, one of which you're going to look at today. I've looked for cases where, because of some strange administrative quirk or some unusual historical event, we can come to some closer approximation than normal of a separation between correlation and causation. So I'll mention a couple of those others and then get to Fiji. In one of my papers, I use a strange administrative quirk that happened in 2 years, 2007 and 2008, in the US government that resulted in a particular kind of visa being randomly allocated, the H-1B skilled worker visa. And I compare a bunch of Indian software programmers who won or lost that lottery to try to get an idea of what the true effect of accessing the US labor market is on those guys. There's another paper where I use a policy discontinuity that happened in the Philippines, another administrative quirk. It was one of many temporary overseas labor programs that the Philippines has, allowing people to work at high wages in Korea for a few years. And the 25,000 people who applied to the job had to pass a Korean language test in order to go. So what we did was we surveyed the households of people who barely passed the test and compared them to the households of people who barely failed the test, on the idea that those households are likely to be extremely similar to each other in all observable and unobservable ways, except that some of them got the opportunity to go to Korea. So this is the genre of thing that I've been doing lately. And another example of it is what I want to get to now, which is this natural experiment in Fiji. Wow, you weren't wrong about this.
It's Microsoft. 12 minutes.
Okay. Every 10 minutes you'll get a break, thanks to Bill Gates. So the question I want to get to today is really simple, and it's what's the effect of the emigration of skilled workers on the stock of skilled workers in a developing country. And this is obviously a question of great policy interest, a great academic interest for many years. Here's a paper that appeared 3 years ago in The Lancet, highly respected British scientific journal, suggesting that anyone who recruits health workers from sub-Saharan Africa, which includes many US companies, should be tried in the International Criminal Court in The Hague alongside the perpetrators of the Srebrenica massacre. So this is the kind of a policy discussion that is happening on this issue. And in a proximate sense, this isn't an interesting research question at all. If a skilled person from Fiji gets on the airplane, that afternoon there's clearly one fewer skilled worker in Fiji. But there's a historical and a theoretical literature in economics that's been around for a while, suggesting that the causal story could be much more complicated than that. The historical literature goes back to some work by several scholars, but including Nobel laureate Simon Kuznets, asking the question back to the 1950s, why educational choices of Jewish people tend to be systematically different from educational choices of non-Jewish people across history. And what Kuznets and many other scholars proposed was that it's actually related to historical patterns of mobility. The people who expect to move might invest in more mobile forms of capital. More recently, in the late 1990s, there's this literature that's come to be known by some as the new economics of migration. A couple of the pioneers were Andrew Mountford and Oded Stark. And the story in their models is a really simple one. It's that for people who have not left a country of migrant origin, job opportunities abroad could influence their human capital investment, even when migration is not certain, when it may or may not happen. And if they respond enough, and if migration is sufficiently uncertain, you can see that you could get countervailing forces. It could be the case that for every 100 skilled people who leave, a certain portion of the people whose education investment decisions were affected by the opportunities abroad, that is because of migration itself, who don't leave, could add to the stock of human capital at home. And it could be the case that for every 100 who leave, 70 are lost, or 20 are lost. Or at least hypothetically, in principle, it could be 0, or even negative. Something that a lot of people would regard as a fanciful theoretical curiosity. But there's been a recent effort to test some of these models. And testing these models faces the empirical challenge that I talked about before. You see across the world lots and lots of countries with low human capital stocks, very few doctors in Niger, and high emigration rates. Lots of Nigerian doctors outside of Niger. And identifying the effect of migration on those stocks is very difficult. it's the effort to get at what the human capital stock of a developing country would have been without skilled migration that I want to use this natural experiment to approximate. So what I'm going to look at is a military coup, the first of 4 that happened in the Fiji Islands. And it sparked one of the largest emigrations from a developing country in recent years, and one that was very highly skill focused. Huge flood of skilled people out of the country. And it's particularly interesting because it happened only in one ethnic group, in broad terms, and not in another ethnic group. And this gives us an opportunity, twofold, to compare what human capital investment and human capital stocks were like, what patterns they were following before any of this happened, and it was sudden and unexpected, and what human capital investment and human capital stocks were like in the ethnic group that was not affected. So what we're shooting for are 2 quasi-control groups created by the experimental setting. And I want to argue 2 things. These are the 2 big things I'm going to try to convince you of before you leave. The first is that the coup caused a couple of things. That it not only caused that huge wave of skilled emigration from the Fiji Islands, but that at the same time it actually caused skill creation, human capital investment by people who were in Fiji. And not just that, but that these forces tended to counteract each other. That's the first thing. And the second thing goes even further and is more of an audacious claim, and it's that the mechanism by which the coups caused skill creation actually passed through immigration. That is, a substantial portion of the skill creation that was caused by the coup happened through the mechanism of causing skilled immigration. These are the 2 claims. So let's get to it. If you don't spend time in Fiji, it's up there, 1,000 miles north of New Zealand. It's a small, isolated, lower middle income country, 850,000 people. It has about the same population as Guyana and Gabon, a $2 billion economy, about the same size as Moldova or Malawi. And living standards are comparable to Philippines or Peru. So not a destitute poor country, but a lower middle income country with lots and lots of poor people. And crucially for this study, it's a multi-ethnic society. So until recently, and you'll see the change, it was roughly evenly divided between Fiji Islanders of indigenous descent, who are there called Fijians, and that's what I'll call them, and Fiji Islanders of South Asian descent, who are there called Indians, and that's what I'll call them too. By the way, I'm European there, because these terms are racial terms, even though I am not from Europe.
I'm a tango here in California.
Well, it's strange. Americans refer to Indians as Indo-Fijians, but Indo-Fijian is not a term that almost anybody in Fiji uses. They call them Indians. And this is I took this photo in downtown Suva. You can see Fijian, 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 Indian, 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 Fijian, 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 Chinese, Fijian, Indian. What happened in 1987 is this experiment, which in its essence, for the purposes of this paper, is a big, sudden, unexpected, and sustained decline in the societal position of Indians. So what happened was, starting with independence from Britain in 1970, Fijians dominated the local political scene and controlled parliament until 1987. In spring of 1987, there was an election in which the National Federation Party, whose prime minister candidate, Timothy Bavandra, was a Fijian but had big support among Indians, won parliament, took over parliament. This was seen as a threat by lots of Fijians, and a month later, a lieutenant colonel in the Fijian-dominated military, Sitiveni Rambuka, arrived with a group of masked men while Parliament was in session, walked in, escorted the Prime Minister and other parliamentarians out and took over the country. That's 1987, and since then, until today, with a couple of vagaries, the Fiji remains under military rule. There was a second coup by Rambuka later that year. There was a racist constitution in 1990, repealed in 1997, a third coup in 2000, and a fourth coup in 2006. Complicated political scene, but the theme of all of these political changes is that the power of the Fijian-dominated military has been retrenched again and again. The Indians never recovered from this. And immediately and since then, the position of Indians in society has been disadvantaged in all kinds of political ways. So the Constitution of 1990, for example, guaranteed Fijians a large permanent majority in the parliament, as well as the position of prime minister forever. It created a large fund for concessional loans to Fijian-owned businesses that were not available to Indians. There was a spate of harsh anti-union legislation, labor unions in Fiji being dominated by Indians historically. There was a total breakdown in the process of negotiation for liberalizing more land ownership by Indians. Most land in Fiji is legally restricted to be owned by the state or by Fijians. There was a huge increase in the availability of tertiary level scholarships for Fijians, and a big restriction in the availability of those scholarships for Indians, lots of other things. Many Indians, among them my co-author, Satish Chand of Australian National University, saw themselves as being permanently disadvantaged by these things and decided to leave for good. Again, apologize for Bill Gates' intervention. So I just want to illustrate this change at the broadest population level. Starting out with the arrival of the Indians, most of their ancestors came between 1879 and 1917 as indentured laborers. This is the emigration pass from Calcutta of one of them, who happens to be the grandfather of my co-author. His name is Matadin. He's from Basti, which is then and now one of the poorest parts of the country. His caste is Chamar, meaning he's a kind of Dalit or untouchable. His next of kin is an uncle, suggesting that he's an orphan. He's a laborer with scars on both shins. This guy is typical. These were not people with any education or any tradition of education in their families, and that's going to be important for this study. Put out of your minds the Indians that Idi Amin threw out of Uganda. This is not any sort of overclass of Indians. These are poor people alongside the indigenous Fijians. And here's the population of Fiji that the British colonists kept very good statistics going back to 1880. And you can see here the Indians arriving as indentured laborers in this period in red. The rest is vegetative growth with just a little bit of immigration. And the Fijians in blue, with green is the total population. And you can see Indians and Fijians growing pretty much in parity for a lot of the post-war period. Up until the 1986 census. Conveniently for us, they did a census right before the military coup. So this was the scene before the coups, and then this happened. So as Indians started to pour out of the country, the Indian population goes into free fall, and the Fijian population continues growing essentially at the same rate. Now, I want to emphasize how economically similar these two groups are. Again, this is not an overclass and an underclass. Here's a bunch of observable characteristics of the two populations before any of this happened. In the earlier mid-1980s, fertility is the same between the two groups. Female life expectancy a little lower for Indians. Infant mortality a little higher for Indians. Unemployment similar. Earnings very similar, and slightly higher poverty rates among Indians. So these are really two groups of poor people living alongside each other. Not just a huge wave of Indians went out after all of this happened, but it was very highly skill focused. And the clear reason for that was that the traditional destinations of these of immigrants from Fiji have been other Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, all of which have point systems on immigration. It's much easier to get in if you have skills and experience. So here is, what you're looking at here is the fraction of the population, total population of Fiji, that is outside, and outside meaning in Australia and New Zealand, which are the two principal destinations. And we put this together by combining the Fiji census with the Australian census and the New Zealand census, all of which conveniently did a census in the same year. So you can see before any of this happened, a year before the coup, 1.9% of each of the two groups outside. Exactly the same fraction. Then the coup happens in 1987. 9 years later, more than 10% of the Indians outside, and the fraction of the Fijians hasn't shifted that much. That is huge flood, huge and very quick flood of Indians out, and very highly skill focused. This is exactly the same numbers for people who in the census list a tertiary degree of some kind. So you see the fraction of Indians and Fijians right before the coup with a tertiary degree being very similar, being outside being very similar. For Indians, suddenly it goes from 10% to 25%. A quarter of the people in just 9 years with tertiary education outside. And one of those was my co-author. So, so that's what I'm talking about when I say the coup is causing skilled immigration. I don't think anybody who has experience with Fiji would doubt that conclusion. But getting to the more interesting stuff is on this side. At the same time, people flooded into school. And not just people, but Indians flooded into school. And I want to show you what I mean by that with various sources of data that we were able to piece together by running around Fiji. I'm going to start with school enrollment data, and also look at graduations, and also look at census data, trying to get different views of human capital investment and human capital stocks in the country. And all I'm going to show you are a bunch of differences regressions. I think a lot of people will be familiar with them. I think a lot of people here also might not ever use or read these things. All they are asking a very simple question, which is, given some outcome, were the trends in that outcome different between these two groups? So controlling for any common trend between the two groups in school enrollment over time, that was the same for both groups. Controlling for any pre-existing difference in the levels of that outcome between the two groups. For example, a lesser or higher propensity of Indians to acquire education than Fijians before any of this happened. Was the evolution, was the time path of the outcome between the two groups different? Was it steeper for one group or shallower? So here, the outcome variable, the dependent variable, is enrollment of 18-year-olds in what they call Form 7, which is the first year of tertiary education. It's a transitional year that you take right before you proceed to university, and you only take if you are proceeding to university. And what this is saying is that the propensity of Indian students relative to before the coup and relative to Fijians shifted 15 percentage points after the coup. Huge increase. And actually, it's been so big that today more than 20% of Indo-Fijian 18-year-olds do this, which, if you know the US statistics, is actually more than the US. So that's how much they've responded to these incentives that were created. People in this country, which is as poor as Peru, are enrolling in tertiary education more than US 18-year-olds do, which is really remarkable. But only the Indians, and only after the coup. Here's another view of the same exact thing. Now this is graduation data, and it's graduation data from only one institution that we could get, but it is the dominant and main institution of tertiary education in Fiji, which is the University of the South Pacific in Suva. So here the outcome is bachelor's degrees awarded by ethnicity. Fijians and Indians in the same regression. And notice here we wouldn't expect the effect to emerge immediately, because You might need some time to save. You need time to do this transitional year, and then you need 4 or 5 years to graduate. So something like 5 or 6 years after the coup is when we expect the effect to emerge. And in fact, it's in 1993 that you start to see a statistically significant divergence between the time paths of these two ethnic groups, and it only grows over time. So something big happens to the human capital investment that Indians were doing right at the time of the coup. So given this, you might expect to see a similar divergence in the stock of educated people. And we can do this because using persuasion tactics that we talked about at dinner last night that no IRB would approve, but fortunately we don't have an IRB, we acquired the entire census of 1986 and 1996. So the numbers in the next regression you'll see aren't a sample of the population, they're the whole population, every man, woman, and child, including my co-author, by the way, we found him in the data. And we can ask the question, in the entire country, what happened in a differences in differences regression on the propensity of an Indian versus a Fijian to have tertiary education. Now, we've seen that investment in tertiary education went up dramatically in Indians versus Fijians at the time of the coup. But we also know that lots of people were leaving. So it's theoretically ambiguous how this is going to go. And in fact, it's 0. So this is a differences in differences regression with the entire population in the regression. 1986 pooled with 1996 with a dummy for 1996 and a dummy for Indian. We threw out the small fraction of the population that is neither Indian nor Fijian. These are 0. I mean, if you've ever done regressions with huge data sets like the census, if there's even a tiny difference, you'll get a t-statistic of like 50. The fact that these aren't significant means that this is really 0, which is remarkable. We see this huge expansion in the human capital investment of Indians versus Fijians, but not in stocks of people who tell the census interviewer, I have attained any form of tertiary education. And what this suggests is that these two effects really are balancing each other. This one is so huge that it's counteracting this one. So that's the evidence we have, and it's strongly suggestive on the first point that I wanted to talk about, which is that these two things have been caused by the coup, and that they are similar in magnitude. But now I want to get to the more audacious one, and the one where our case is a little less strong, because I think the bar to prove it is much higher, which is that in fact the mechanism passes through migration, that it was migration itself that caused, at least to some substantial degree, that skill creation. And my approach to trying to convince you of that claim will be a bunch of falsification tests. I'm going to put up a bunch of tests that where I would expect to see some kind of result, some kind of causal result, if the mechanism were other than this, and show you that I can't find any evidence of any other mechanism at play. And that's the philosophers of science would call that a corroboration rather than a test. But I'd like to know how persuasive you find it. So the first thing I want to do is ask, at what level of education were these things happening? This is exactly the data that you saw before on the same table you saw before on enrollment at Form 7, which remember is the first year of tertiary education for 18-year-olds. And I'm juxtaposing that with the same regression where the outcome variable is now Form 4, which is the equivalent of US 10th grade, 15-year-olds. And there's no effect for those guys, no statistically significant effect, which is remarkable. We could imagine mechanisms where something about the coup happens to affect across the board the incentives for Indians to get education, but really we're seeing this focused at the tertiary level, and that is the only thing that is relevant for the point systems of Australia and New Zealand. Having a secondary degree doesn't help you, having a tertiary degree does. And not just that, but having a tertiary degree in particular disciplines helps you more, And that's the subject of this next table. So again, this is the same data on University of South Pacific aggregate graduations that you saw before. This table I put up on the screen before. And now I'm going to disaggregate that by faculty. We don't have more disaggregated data than that, but there are 4 faculties at the university. And what we see is that the effect only happens in the faculties that are giving degrees that are relevant for these point systems. So for example, you can get more points going into Australia if you are an accountant, if you are an IT professional, and if you're an English teacher. And the faculties that give those degrees are, in the case of accountant, business and economics, that's BE. In the case of IT, it's science and technology. And in the case of English teacher, it's arts and letters, or AL. And the 4th column is another faculty of the university called Islands and Oceans, or IO. And they give degrees like tourism, oceanography, geology, agronomy, none of which will give you any extra points on the Australian skilled occupation list. So again, this is just corroboration. This is not a hypothesis test, but this pattern is interesting. That this pattern of Indians pouring into tertiary education didn't happen in the only faculty that is irrelevant to the point systems at the destination. Just to show you what one of these looks like, this is the business and economics faculty with Indian graduations in red, Fijian graduations in blue, and remember the coup happens here. Then take 5 or 6 years for the graduations to kick in, and that's when you get this divergence. Finally, let's look at the census data. Again, this is the same as the census data you saw before, except here I'm disaggregating by age. And we can do this because we have everybody. So even tiny little slices in the age distribution will give you big samples. And this is where you saw 0 coefficients before for the entire population. For 18-year-olds only, it's a huge and positive. For early 20s, much smaller but still positive. Get over 20 and it starts to be negative. And we can actually do this age by age. So this is the same regression with that differences in differences coefficient graphed on the vertical axis. And this is 16-year-olds to 65-year-olds. Again, this is just a corroboration exercise, but if in fact these people, as is anecdotally reported, were acquiring their education in order to get out, this is the age where you would expect it to be concentrated. Because after age 30 or 35, you start to get sufficiently fewer points for being old that it's hard to compensate and get over the points threshold by acquiring a desired degree. That's where the incentives fall apart. Again, all of this is just corroboration. But, and that's why I think it's important to think of all the alternative models of how that skill creation effect might have happened, some of which could have been purely domestic, and some additional falsification tests, and that's what I'll close with. I'm very skeptical of all of these, as you can easily tell. I'm skeptical of these other mechanisms, and the reason I'm skeptical of them is really simple, which is that there would have had to have been a lot of very surprised people investing in education for reasons that were purely domestic, who then suddenly ended up abroad. You saw just 9 years after the coup, a quarter of the tertiary educated people of Fiji were suddenly outside. And if those people were investing in education for reasons that didn't have to do with migration, if they were investing because of things that happened because of the coup in the local labor market, they would have all had to have been wrong about where they were going to be in just a few years. And that's possible in principle. In practice, I think it's unlikely that so many people would be systematically wrong. But let's say that it's possible. What are some other models that could explain this effect? Well, there are lots of them. The most obvious one is that there's some systematic difference between Indians and Fijians. That could be the case. There could be some sort of Greg Clark might argue that there could be a genetic difference between them.
It only kicked in
Exactly. Exactly. So the fact that we're doing differences and differences regressions and controlling for pre-existing differences, as Frank just said, throws doubt. Also remember that these Indians are not people who had any sort of family or other tradition of education. Essentially, all of the indentured laborers were very poor, lower caste people. A lot of the same falsification tests that would apply to that alternative theory if it were the case that there was something about Indians that responded to the coup by investing in all kinds of education. We would have seen a similar effect at lower levels of education, and we would have seen a similar effect in disciplines that had nothing to do with the point system of the destinations. How about a story like this? Suppose that the demand for Indians, the demand by Indians for education didn't change after the coup. Alan Winters suggested this possibility to us. Suppose that the government, for some reason, greatly expanded the supply of tertiary education right after the coup. They'd be trying to rebuild the country. And Fijians, for some reason, could not or did not want to take advantage of the new slots that were available, and Indians, with their pre-existing demand, just took the slots. Their demand didn't change, it was just that supply expanded. These are all the data we could get on the government subsidy to the two most important tertiary education institutions in the country at the time. The University of the South Pacific subsidy in blue, real Fiji dollars over time, and the Fiji Institute of Technology subsidy in gray. And there's a modest upward trend in the USP subsidy, but nothing like a doubling or tripling or quadrupling. The huge majority of the Indians who were going to school at this time were paying their own way, a lot of them by liquidating the retirement savings of their parents. There's no evidence of a huge increase in government-funded supply at this time. And in fact, in terms of scholarships, as I mentioned, the supply response was exactly the opposite. The government strictly reduced scholarships available to Indians and greatly expanded them for Fijians, which would give you the opposite effects of the ones we've been seeing. Please.
The number of places in the university?
There's a new university opened, wasn't
So the Fiji College of Advanced Education, the FCAE, opened in 1992, but from its inception, at least 50% of the slots there were reserved for Fijians, which continues today. And they actually have different entrance scores for Fijians and Indians. To get in, you have to get a much higher score as an Indian to be admitted, and they adjust that so that they have at least 50% Fijians.
But then that leaves more for the others. That leaves more space in the others.
By racially restricting the entrances to the FCAE. I mean, but that doesn't create new spaces at the other institutions. I mean, more spaces were created, obviously. They weren't sitting on the lawn. But the point is the government subsidies did not create them. The Indians, by paying for their educations, created them. They paid for the expansion. That's why I'm comfortable.
So there was an expansion in the number of places?
Yes, definitely. Yes. I mean, lots more students in the business and economics faculty, and they expanded new classrooms, and they hired more professors, but it wasn't the government expanding the supply. If anything, they were restricting the supply of publicly subsidized education available to Indians. That's how large the demand was for these slots, was that Indians created them, which is quite remarkable.
Can I just remind, but this flattening out of the Fijian curve here, so you're getting a situation which you would think would have led to a political reaction or some kind of reaction which leads to dominating tertiary education, at least in this faculty. And where you get this flattening out of the number of Fijians it's not obvious exactly why that would be happening.
I mean, I don't know that we would need to have my Fiji Islander co-author to talk about the reality of the Fiji. Theoretically, I know that what happened was that life became a lot easier for you if you're Fijian, in that the number of government jobs, which are the main jobs that everybody wants, reserved for Fijians, went way up, and the requirement to signal your ability by getting a tertiary degree plausibly went down. Yeah. But I don't know that happened because I don't know Fiji well enough. But But there are lots of other possible explanations for this. Another one that people have pointed out to us is that maybe Indians' demand for education didn't change at all. They always had high demand for education, but because of this immigration, relatives abroad allowed them to finance with remittances more education. No change in demand, but they were credit constrained before, and remittances allowed them to be less credit constrained. So there is one ever household income and expenditure survey in Fiji. They actually tried to do two, but one of them was suppressed because it was not done right. But one exists from 2002, and we can ask, we can do a regression in which expenditure on different kinds of education is on the left-hand side, and this is just the coefficient on Indian, on a dummy for Indian household in the household income and expenditure survey, asking, is there any difference between the primary education expenditures, secondary education expenditures, and tertiary education expenditures for Indian versus Fijian households, with and without a bunch of other controls for household characteristics. And one of those controls is receipt of remittances by the household. So if the reason for statistically significantly more expenditure on tertiary education by Indian households than Fijian households were remittances, putting remittance receipts in the regression would have to make this coefficient go down. And in fact, it goes up. So we don't see any evidence that is consistent with this big increase in enrollments being systematically financed by remittances. Yes. So you're right. To be really careful about it, I should be comparing the controls, that is everything but remittances, to everything with remittances. That's true. So the controls are total income, remittances in particular, number of household members who are school age, a dummy for whether the household head is female, and the number of females in the household. And you're right, that would be a better way to do it. Please.
What happens to the total? You're talking about whether there was a positive net impact, this change on the investment in capital. We're talking only on the last one, and you emphasize the decrease, but there is a substantial decrease in the first and second.
So this would be extremely interesting to do, but we can't actually do it because there's only one time point. So this isn't an increase in expenditures. This is not a diffs and diffs regression like we saw before. This is just one cross-section in 2002, comparing expenditures by Indian versus Fijian households on tertiary education. That's it. So I would like to do that, but this is something else. This is just asking a few other observable traits equal. Do Indian households spend more on tertiary education, and is that systematically related to their remittances?
The number of graduates, undergraduates, and graduates over the years, this number. Look at the proportions of the household, or the possibility that the household will have a graduate in primary, secondary, and graduate.
We have the census data with which you could do that, but the problem is that the census data is net of investment and departures, in that it's just the number of people who were in the country at the time. So we don't have household data on just the investment side, like school enrollment. That doesn't exist. We would love to have that. In the census? Yes, definitely. But it would be net of all the people who left.
Okay, you can compare houses with children a year before graduation and undergraduate and secondary.
Yes, absolutely. But so the problem with that is that the census doesn't ask income, like a lot of censuses. The U.S. Census does, but most censuses don't because they don't believe in the responses. So we don't have in the census data. Where's the census data? We control for, right, so this is with and without controls. The controls, we were trying to get at things which are correlated with income, which are construction material of the house, type of toilet you have, number of fraction of children who have died in the household, the number of people per room, and whether or not you have electricity. So we were trying to get at the correlates, but all we have is that wealth index, and that's it. I don't mean to put off your question by saying we don't have the data, but this was all that we could get. But you're exactly right that this is what we would want to do, and what a lot of people suggested was, why aren't you doing Mincer regressions to show what happens to the returns to education before and after? And that's exactly what we'd like to do, but the data actually don't exist to do that.
There is no yearbook of graduation in universities, but it's a handful of universities.
Yes, yes. So that's what this is. This is exactly from the we hired an RA to go through the yearbook of University of the South Pacific and go by names.
This is for the third degree, right?
For tertiary, exactly.
So you can do the same for the BA and the MA, and you can compare. Putting the analogy here. So see if there was a fall in the BA and MA.
But this is BAs and MAs. I mean, but that's what I mean by tertiary. I mean all post-secondary education, associate degree, bachelor's degree, and postgraduate. We don't have graduation data at the pre-tertiary level. These are really good suggestions, but a lot of them we can't implement. I want to. Do I have a couple of more minutes, and then I'll wrap up. Another thing that we might think have happened in Fiji is that the returns to alternative investments other than human capital might have changed. So suppose the returns to dropping out of school changed a lot. What if the returns to being an unskilled laborer went way down? That might bring people to stay in school and get higher levels of tertiary education for reasons that have nothing to do with emigration. That's why we collected, and again, imagine me in the back room of a ministry in Suva, taking pictures of all of the books I can find in a room where everything's sort of scattered around. That's the reason for these gaps in the data. There are some numbers that just nobody in Suva can tell you where to find them. Some of these we had to get in a sub-basement of the Harvard Library, which had statistical manuals that the Fiji government itself didn't have anymore. But this is as complete a series as we could get on government statistics on the average unskilled wage in agriculture and construction, deflated by inflation into real Fiji dollars. We don't see a big dip in the post-coup period, which is what you might think would happen if the returns to dropping out of school and becoming an unskilled laborer had changed to a great degree. It's also conceivable that the returns to alternative investments like entrepreneurship, land, changed greatly after the coup. Anecdotally, we don't have evidence of that. There wasn't a massive campaign of expropriating Indian-owned businesses, no window smashing campaign. Talking to a lot of the Indians who are in Australia, none of them say it was because I couldn't make it there anymore, or my business wasn't viable anymore. What they talk about is that they didn't feel like their political future in the country had anything to offer, and that was the primary reason for leaving, not a big change in the returns to their capital investments. As for land, as I mentioned before, the large majority of land in Fiji is legally restricted to be owned only by the state or by native Fiji islanders. Only 8% of the land can be owned by Indians. A lot of them lease land from Fijian landlords and are therefore much less subject to variance in the price of land, not much of which happened in the post-coup period anyway. So that it is conceivably possible that the returns to alternative investments changed so much that for purely domestic reasons it could cause big shifts in human capital investment. But we don't see much evidence of that, and as I've tried to argue, a lot of the patterns in human capital investment are consistent with the kind of investment you would see if people were investing for the exterior, for being overseas. So what I want to close with is just a word about external validity. This is obviously tightly circumscribed when we're talking about the Fiji Islands situation. It's a very interesting natural laboratory because of the sudden onset of the migration, because of its huge scale, because the destinations are highly skill selective, because of this ethnic specificity, because the geographic isolation of Fiji means that undocumented movement is almost non-existent. There are no boat people who try to make it 1,000 miles, or essentially none. All of these things make it an interesting laboratory, but they also tightly circumscribe the kind of lessons, the kind of generalizable lessons. What I want to argue is that the generalizable lesson is that a movement whose proximate effects are almost universally seen as being disastrous, and this huge movement of people out after the coup, you can see in the journalism of the time and policy speeches at the time, was universally seen as something which must be draining the country of graduates and must be permanently hobbling the development prospects of the country. Things might be much more complicated than that. And in fact, this is a setting where things that seemed obvious in their proximate effects, like the stock of Indians who are educated, must certainly, clearly, and don't waste my time with regressions, be going down relative to Fijians, actually didn't. And that is what I want to leave you with. Thanks very much for all your attention. Please.
So, on that last point, I guess what I'm wondering is, so skill creation is, partly, or you probably think of it as an interaction between natural abilities. One might wonder whether the ones who actually managed to leave were the highest ability types, and so that even though you're in effect replacing them, or you've got more people with degrees staying, their lower ability, and thus it seems like it's, you can compare this one measure of degrees, but in terms of actual productivity of the people, there might be systematic difference. And so it still could be quite a net negative effect, right? Kind of the best and brightest are the ones who are actually taken up.
For sure. I mean, the conclusion I want to challenge is the idea that the departure of a person who has tertiary education must mean a decline in the stock by one. That doesn't mean that human capital equals the possession of a certain kind of degree. There are all kinds of human capital, critical thinking skill, intelligence quotients, work experience, which we're not measuring here, tacit knowledge, all of which could be going dramatically down. We're just looking at one thing, and I agree completely.
If I could just, one small thing, why don't we see the secondary education going up if that's a condition for tertiary education?
Yeah, so good point. The way that I interpret that is, so a large fraction of the Fiji Islands population doesn't complete secondary school, if we're going to think about the marginal effects of a given change in people's incentives, the question is who would be most responsive to a marginal change in the incentives to get a tertiary degree? Somebody who, in the absence of that additional incentive, would have completed high school anyway, or somebody who, in the absence of that additional incentive, wouldn't have completed high school. If I'm living on an outlying island and from a poor family that never got a degree, and in the absence of any of these changes, I would have stopped school at age 12, the chances that this change in incentives are going to affect my education decisions is going to be much lower, because I have to make an enormously higher marginal investment in order to get to the end of a university degree than does somebody who was kind of thinking about it and at the time said, I'm going to do this so that I can get out. Do you see what I mean? That might be a reason for a nonlinear effect, but that's completely hypothetical, and I don't have evidence of that.
Could you say something about the relative cost of the investment in education? In other words, how much of a hit does the parents' retirement fund take from drawing down to fund the education? And secondly, I believe that the point systems of both New Zealand and Australia put up nursing as a very highly desired immigration skill. So did you do a male-female regression on, presumably these are mostly unmarried people leaving. Did you do a gender breakdown on whether young skilled nurses, Indian skilled nurses were leaving, and whether there was a correlation between education of, say, nursing for women?
So these are both great questions, and I'm inadequate to them. So on the first question, I don't know what fraction of a typical family's wealth was driven into this investment. Anecdotally, it's a lot, because people were doing whatever they could to get out, and especially a lot of them with the idea that they would bring mom and dad later. So it's something that people would obviously be willing to invest a lot of their liquid assets in, but I can't answer it. So on the second one, nursing is incredibly important, and most of the nurses who would have been moving here were educated at the other institution, which is the Fiji Institute of Technology, and not at the University of the South Pacific. And we tried to do exactly the same graduation analysis for them, and they didn't have any of their records. So we went to the FIT and dug around in the library for an entire afternoon, and the president of the university is a friend of Satish's, and they gave us everybody to help us look around, and nobody could find them. That's the fragility of the institutions. So we don't have any information on nurses in particular, and no, we didn't break it down by gender, because within these disciplines it wouldn't have been something beneficial, and it just didn't occur to us to look at nurses in particular by looking at women, although that's an interesting idea.
So, what if there'd been no coup, but Australia and New Zealand are booming through this time period? They've done their reforms and they're booming, and they have a point system, and there's a lot of ethnic Indian networks in New Zealand and Australia. Do you get the exact identical result?
Yes. So we'd see a lot of people moving out if they were constrained in movement by, say, a capital constraint that people could alleviate by sending money. We'd see skill focus, especially if the availability of jobs because of the boom were shaped by the point system.
And plus, I think the point system also counts relatives in country too, right? They get points. At least I know that they've gone to a randomized system now. Once you've met those points, but I think you get points for having relatives in the country.
Yes, you do.
So that would just reinforce this.
No, this is a good critique. So the one thing that makes me doubt is the sustained nature of these changes, and that's one thing that makes this a great laboratory, is that it happened long enough ago so that we have a lot of data since it happened, and it happened not too long ago so that we have some data before it happened. And if it were just a few good years at the destination and that changed people's decisions, and we were just looking right after the event, it's more likely that there was some coincident event, like a big economic boom that didn't happen, by the way, in Australia and New Zealand at this time, that could be generating a spurious result, because every diffs and diffs is just saying, whatever would have happened at the same time could easily bear the same attribution of causation. The fact that these changes were sustained, I have to quote Bill one more time, over time, and didn't just go away. It wasn't if we only had data on this, rather than it being something that was sustained over time, I'd be more inclined to believe an alternative story like that, because if it were just incentives created by a short-term boom, it would have to be that all these people were waiting around hoping that such a boom was going to happen again in the future, which is a little bit less of a plausible story. But none of which rules out this possibility. Because every diffs and diffs regression, because it's not happening in a laboratory, is just saying, look, I'm attributing causation to the thing that happened at this time, and something else might have happened.
Could you comment on intermarriage?
So that's there's almost none, one of there are many reasons for that, but one of the most obvious is that essentially all of the Fijians describe themselves as Christian, and almost none of the Indians are. They're all either Hindu or Muslim, which is why if you get a burger in Suba, it's a lamb burger. There's not only is there no pork, but there's no beef available. There are, I met one mixed race person who was half Chinese, half Fijian, and she has bizarre experiences in the country because voting is racially allocated. So, as I mentioned, there are seats of parliament that are reserved only for Indians, seats of parliament that are reserved only for Fijians, a lot more reserved for Fijians than Indians, but there are reserved for both. And when you go into the polling center, there's a guy at the door who directs you to a different line depending on your race. So she described the experience of walking into the polling station and being sort of scrutinized about whether she was Chinese, which would mean line number 3, or Fijian, which would mean line number 1. And in different elections, she had been directed to different lines.
So she can't elect.
What's
She
that?
can't elect which one she is. What's her passport say?
Well, the thing is, she herself was conflicted about whether she thought that she should be voting as a Fijian or whether, I mean, she didn't consistently self-identify as one or the other, but the voting system requires it. But the existence of these systems is just an illustration of how rare this mixing is. Such a system could not. If 10% of the population were mixed, that could never happen. But because it's so rare, it's an extraordinary anomaly to be half and half. But it does exist, but it's a tiny fraction of the population.
Let's go all the way to the back.
I have a related question to one that Scott asked. I guess the other factor that I could see happening right around the same period is sort of the technology boom, especially with IT. And so we might either think that the Indians had a better network in Australia and New Zealand, or that they just had a history of mobility and moving towards whatever, wherever there was good industry. Since they had moved to Fiji, whereas the Fijians maybe would be less inclined to do that. And I know that Fiji remains one of the technologically least advanced countries I've ever been to. So it seems like maybe that could be a possible alternative explanation that would not just be a short-term boom, but maybe would be a somewhat more sustained boom that would affect the Fijians differently from, the Indians differently from the native Fijians. I guess I was thinking about ways that you might get around this is just by looking at maybe the English majors rather than also including the accounting and business majors in there, because that would be sort of a less technical profession, or if you could get data on these nurses. It would be interesting to just see those broken out. That might give us some confidence. Or if there are other countries in which there's sort of this division between two societies, one with the history of mobility in the boom China.
Thanks. This is a great point. And you and Scott are pushing me to go beyond what I did, which was just sit around having coffee with Satish, who lives in Australia, telling me, I've been there since that time and nothing like that happened. We didn't actually gather data on it. I don't have data on employment conditions in the IT sector over time, or economic growth, or employment conditions more generally at the destinations. And we really should establish that nothing big happened. He has asserted that, and I just sort of believed it, but I should do more than that. And this is a plausible story. Both what you're saying and what Scott is saying are plausible stories.
I wonder, what does it have to say about welfare implications? In some sense, you talked about human capital investment, which is a good measure to human capital investment. But the welfare is kind of puzzling, or I'm wondering, what do you think about it? What's special about your case is that there's no violence at home, and there's no large changes in demand from the outside, right? So it's a push story, which is not violent and sudden, but rather gradual. It starts at a particular point of time, but it's not violent. People don't run away, right? So the people who did invest in acquiring this higher education could have done it before and decided not to do it. Now they decide to do it, and some of them are leaving, and the same number stays, or the numbers do not change, right? So what do we do with it? So does it mean that before there was no social and private, there was no private gain to invest in education? That's for sure. Was there social gain for investing in education or not? See, that's the issue. I mean, is it a pure waste in the sense that they didn't want to go to Australia, with all due respect to the beautiful beaches, right? And basically were forced out because of these political changes, just like you described? Or is it the case that there is some some market failure? They should have invested in education and did not, and therefore this was a good change from society point of view.
Thanks.
So I just want two-finger to mention that. I was going to ask that in a slightly different way, which is, do you know what happens to labor mobility for Indians within Fiji? Do they actually get a status change within Fiji if they decide not to go? And there are some who presumably decide not to go. So is it a wasted investment? So the Abner's doing it. And also, might this stem the tide, which eventually get a stoppage of out-migration if labor mobility improves?
These are great questions, and I have focused this narrowly on the effect on the stock of educated people, just because that is a tractable question. The stock of educated people is not in anybody's utility or social welfare function directly. Obviously, it's welfare is the question. And as you suggested, it hinges crucially on human capital externalities. And now here's an area where development policymakers in Washington are completely convinced of one result, which is that human capital externalities are huge, and just having a lot of educated people in Fiji is going to create massive social benefit, and no skilled person in a country as poor as Fiji is possibly going to be getting paid their marginal social product. Economics is different. So my reading of the literature, and this could be different from yours, is that that's actually very poorly established. And so there are some work by Ajimolo and Angrist 10 years ago trying to use different states' schooling laws and child labor laws to identify the effect of how much education the people around you have on the returns to your own education, and they find nothing in the United States. And then in developing countries, there's what I think is a fascinating paper by Len Pritchett, in which he called it "Where Has All the Education Gone?", in which he asks the question, how is it possible that if education has massive economic external effects, how is it possible that schooling completion rates at most basic levels vastly expanded in sub-Saharan Africa during 3 decades of the 20th century, in which economic growth was 0.0% in sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah.
I think in economics that's actually very poorly established. So I don't have any empirical basis to go beyond this to social welfare. It could be that a lot of this human capital investment is purely signaling. It's even theoretically possible that all of it is purely signaling, and that the only thing these people are trying to do is get a credential which they can take the Australian High Commission and say, please let me into Australia, and it doesn't make them any more productive. I learned an Australian term in having a discussion like this when a question in a seminar at the World Bank asked, are they all working in dairies? And I said, well, you mean they're all milking cows or something? And then they informed me that a dairy in Australia is a convenience store. I don't know why. Are you Australian?
Milkshakes, they're for milkshakes.
Okay. It's for that reason. Okay. So the question was, are they all working in convenience stores, and are they getting any returns, economic returns to this education, which would have implications for their own welfare, for Australia's welfare, and for the counterfactual welfare of Fiji? And we don't have any information on that. So this is not a satisfying answer, but I really can't go beyond this. To me, it is an interesting question whether or not the stock of educated people goes up or down, because it's so clear to so many people that the proximate effect must dominate. But the more interesting questions that you're getting at, we don't have evidence to get to. And I think actually the discipline doesn't have evidence to get to. And I want to get to your question too. We don't have data on internal labor mobility. So, but can you tell me more about why you're interested in that? Because you were going somewhere with that question.
Well, I'm wondering if it would eventually have some kind of reverse political effect. And your story is that they're leaving because they're worried about the political future since the coup, right? So I wonder if it meant that investing in education for those who aren't able to amass enough points to emigrate, end up staying in Fiji, actually changes their ultimately first their economic and then political status. So it's kind of a modernization story. And so could that in the longer run be possible? This is going to make you conjecture again. But I'd be interested in seeing if it gets
not just conjecture, but ignorantly conjecture.
It provides them with any kind of labor mobility in Fiji, so it's not a
So these are fascinating questions, and we haven't asked them at all. The census, as I mentioned, doesn't have income in it, so we couldn't ask whether the returns to education changed. It does have occupation.
I was going to say it should have occupation.
So we could ask things like, if you have a tertiary if you have tertiary attainment, what happens to the probability that you're working in a professional kind of job? But that's about it. Things about political status, I don't think we could touch with the data that I know about. But also very interesting.
But I mean, just the development of a sort of middle class, I guess, sort of lifting themselves, and having the effect that one would expect education to have. But the data in other places doesn't necessarily bear out.
No, very interesting question. But yeah.
Not something you can write.
No, with the census there might be something to do, but it would have to be created.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, so I'm wondering how much you can generalize. I was struck by your observation, comment about the difference in scores between Fijians and Indians in this newly educated institution. So is there some unobserved variable which you're actually not capturing, even with your current methodology, which suggests that somehow Indians are more able to take advantage of these educational opportunities? I mean, it's so striking given what you showed about the similarity of background. So if things had been reversed and there'd been an Indian coup, and Fijians were then confronted with these opportunities, I mean, do you think, you can't answer this, I mean, but would there have been the same outcomes, or is there in fact something, for Indians, whatever, history of migration, whatever it might be, which made them more able to adapt than might have been the case for Fijians? You can guess at this one too, just...
For sure. So you're pointing out yet another fragile assumption of any differences in differences exercise, which is called the common trends assumption, which is that the trend in all of these outcomes between the two ethnic groups would have been identical. And we're controlling for pre-existing differences in levels. So we're controlling for every observable or unobservable correlate of the different levels of the outcomes, but not every conceivable, not any conceivable observable or unobservable correlate of different time paths. So if Indians were natively somehow more able to respond to these incentives, and the coup had been reversed, it's not necessarily the case that there would have been any effect on Fijians' behavior. So that's an assumption, and I think in this case it's a plausible assumption, but it's one I can't defend.
Yeah, I mean, it makes the problem of generalization difficult.
For sure.
Another question pertaining to generalization. You started out, Michael, with a very strong, incredibly general statement by referring to that article in Lancet.
Yes.
So, where am I now, after I've listened to your talk, with respect to the general proposition put forward in Lancet?
So, there are. This is an argument with many logical steps, and if it ends in the defender's docket at the criminal court in The Hague, there are many steps to get there. You could agree that the recruitment of health workers from Malawi decreases 1-to-1 the number of health workers in Malawi without thinking that people should be in the criminal court. But let's just say that one of many assumptions you would need to believe this argument is that that encouraging the emigration of health workers from sub-Saharan Africa decreases to some substantial degree the stock of health workers in Africa. And whether or not that's true, I'm very confident that it need not be true always and everywhere. And the reason for that is some work that I've done in the Philippines, where, and this fact blows my mind, there are 6 times the registered nurses per capita in the population as the typical country in the income per capita group of the Philippines. Way more than Malaysia, which is much richer and which sends far fewer nurses abroad. Way more than Thailand, which is much richer and sends fewer nurses abroad. More than Great Britain, more than Austria, is the number of registered nurses. These are full bachelor's degree nurses working as nurses in the Philippines. More than Great Britain in this poor country. And I've never heard a plausible explanation from anybody that could explain that, some sort of genetic predisposition for Filipinos to become nurses, that is not related to migration itself, to the fact that the solid majority of all foreign-born nurses in the US are only from one country, Philippines. The majority of all nurses, period, in Saudi Arabia are Filipino. Tens of thousands of people flowing out a year. 80% of registered nurse graduates in the Philippines leave, go out, and the 20% that stays gives them more nurses than Great Britain. the only mechanism that's theoretically plausible to me for that to happen is that something in this necessary causal chain of reasoning is going awry before we would get to the criminal docket. It could be the case that with a different institutional arrangement, like more private nursing schools resembling the Filipino ones in Jamaica, nurse immigration from Jamaica could create nurses in Jamaica. And that's something that I think criminalizing the procedure bludgeons to death when a more nuanced view would be more appropriate.
One more question?
I just had a very similar question to Steve's, and that's about the differential proclivity of Indians to leave, or ability of Indians to leave. You convinced me that the coup was sudden, but was it really unforeseen, and how much political instability was there leading up to the coup? Were Indians maybe more risk averse because they, I don't know, were they already taking some measures, perhaps not observable, but latent measures to protect themselves against political instability later?
So that's a great question, and I've just asserted that it was sudden and unexpected because, again, my co-author says there he was, and nobody thought that this country, which had been very stable both before independence and since independence, would ever be the setting in which the military would walk into parliament and escort everybody out and say we're taking over for the next 30 years. But that said, I want to look at the if I can find it, the graph of emigration out, which goes up a little bit for Indians before the coup happened, suggesting that it might be a little more complex than that. If I can find this thing, it's here.
And was there racism already in the country?
Yes, for sure. And Indians, I mentioned this negotiation process to try to open up more land ownership, more than the 8% of the country that Indians can even legally own right now. So one great thing about Fiji is that, as I mentioned, there's almost no undocumented movement. So they count up the number of arrivals and departures by race at all of the ports and the airports. And you can get a very clear movement of who's going in or out. And this is just departures minus arrivals by ethnic group by year. So if the same person is going in and out and in and out and in and out, those would all cancel and be zero. And you can see a little bit of a greater tendency for Indians to be leaving since independence than Fijians. Huge spike right after 1987, but notice also a little bit of an upward trend in the 2 years before that. So maybe some uneasiness, maybe some fears about how the election was going to turn out, whether or not the military would accept the result, but nothing like what came thereafter. So you're challenging the sharpness of this DD, and I think that's a good thing to do, but it's not that fuzzy.
Right. Well, I presume your co-author Satish is not working in the dairy, but is an economist.
Yes.
To the extent that economists act on general welfare, then there's at least one case in which the general welfare did increase as a result of this.
That's a big assumption.
Exactly. Let's
This is the world. This is social welfare, individual welfare.
Okay, so well, the next seminar will be the externalities of having more economists in the world. But thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you very much.